you'll recall from last time, we went to some very critical topics and we discussed some very, very important information. And we introduced certain topics of the way the Hanukkah Yichud essentially works. And what we said was that it is possible, what we essentially said was, what are the consequences of a person's transgressions or sins? What are the consequences? And we examined this in a more detailed way. And what we established was that there seems to be two basic modes in which the Hanukkah HaYichud works, with the tahara, or the purification of a neshama, proceeds. And what we said was that when a person does a chet, that sin produces, of course, an existential damage inside the substance of the neshama, which should cause an aspect of annihilation, but instead it's externalized, and when it's externalized, it blocks, it becomes like an outer shell on the neshama, metaphorically speaking. Now what that does is prevents the shechina, you see, or the shefa, the power, or the light of God, or the light of the Bnei Shem, to then access this neshama, and this causes enormous pain for the neshama. The critical thing is that the neshama loses its ability, because of that klipa or shell around it, to draw in the kedusha that it needs to elevate the entire world. That's who said that, and I think that's the very important thing. The neshama, with that klipa, loses its ability to be mazachech, or to purify, or transform physical reality. But that's the relationship of that neshama, or the person who has that neshama, to the hashpor, or the power that's coming to him. It's like a boomerang effect, you see. Because what he does is, he creates the klipa around himself, and he creates a shell, so to speak, or a blockage around the Shekhinah, so that the light no longer comes down, and as it no longer comes down, he will be losing his kedusha. We said also that there was another effect, and we call that triangulation effect. And this was a very strange thing, where what happens is that the kedusha that is blocked by the Shekhinah, so that it does not come down to the person, then is absorbed by another individual who is connected to that barrier around the Shekhinah. That's in essence what it is. The sins of a person creates barriers around the Shekhinah. When the barriers are created, the light of the Shekhinah is withheld by it. But it can be transferred to other people who are evil in their own right, or do bad things by themselves, and they connect to that barrier, so that the kedusha then of a person then descends or is transferred to another individual. And there's a kind of a triangulation effect. Now what does that do? When the other individual has an aspect of kedusha which belongs to someone else, in a way, well, what happens is that person then is able to exert an aspect of certain power over the other individual, and by doing that he can cause them great pain. And we said that he can cause them physical, psychological, spiritual pain, you see. And that's what happens. These two people, the one who is transgressed, and then the perpetrator, or rather the individual who now possesses the power of the transgressor, will meet in some providential way. They will be drawn to each other through the mechanisms of providence and the mechanisms of hashgacha in an incredibly calculating way. And then what will happen is that the association that they will have together will be a very painful one for the transgressor. What does that pain do? What that pain does, and this is very, very important, what that pain does is that gradually, as the aggressor causes pain to the transgressor, get a little confusing here. What happens is that the power is slowly withdrawn from that aggressive person, the aggressor, or perpetrator, and it goes back to the individual who caused the sin in the first place. How does it do that? Because what happens is that individual, by causing him pain, slowly causes the barrier of the Shekhinah in which he's connected to, and he's taking the power to disappear. And when that barrier disappears, you see, no longer can he oppress the other individual. This is essentially what occurs over here, and it is a tremendous hashgacha. The essential purpose of that kind of association is to restore to a person who sins an equilibrium, an internal equilibrium, a spiritual equilibrium that is lost by virtue of his sins. And that equilibrium is restored to him through either some misfortunes that occur to the person himself, or through the oppressiveness of another individual who has usurped that person's power. Either way, the power then is retrieved, and that's the essence of this entire mechanism, retrieval. The retrieval of the Kedusha that's lost. This entire process that I described is the process of the Ahunus HaYichud. It is a manifestation of the Tigboris Hara, the ascendancy of evil. Its essential objective is retrieval of one's lost power, the re-establishment of spiritual equilibrium, and the important word that describes that process is Tahara. That's the important word that always describes that process. Whenever you see the word Tahara in your davening or in the talk, essentially it refers to that process. Now, we have also said last time, a very important thing is that this triangulation process is the mechanism in which the Banishim uses primarily to redeem the world and to rehabilitate the Jews. So, what we have just described on an individual plane exists on a national collective plane. And this was the basic promise that the Banishim said to Avram. The basic promise that he gave to Avram. That one of the aspects of the promise. There are other aspects that we will go into when we speak about Pesach. But one of the critical aspects of his promise to Avram was that I promise you that the Jews will be able to inherit Olam Haba. They will. Because even if they sin, the mechanism of this triangulation will exist to restore to them that power. But the one that will restore that power will be another nation. So what the Banishim essentially described to Avram when he said that the Jews will go into Egypt for 400 years is the mechanism of the Golus itself, of all exiles. All exiles are based on this principle, and it's very, very critical to understand this. They're all based on this principle. The Medrash says that essentially God said to Avram, I give you a choice of Tahara. And the essential choice was either Tahara in a spiritual sense, Gehenna, or I will allow the Tahara to take place through Golus, exile. And Avram chose Golus, so exile. What is the Tahara of exile? How does it work? The way I've described. Except that the individual who transgressed is now replaced by the Jews as a nation who has transgressed. The oppressor as an individual is now replaced by another nation who is an oppressor. And the mechanism essentially works the same way. That is the mechanism of the Golus. That is why the Jews go from one nation to another. Now the matter, of course, is much more complex. But at this point, I would like to say the essential explanation of what the Holocaust was about. This was its mechanism. Now we will not go into the nature of the sins that the Jews had to commit to wind up into that kind of whole or barbaric situation, but what is clear, what is incredibly clear, is that the German people were chosen, and we will get into this later, into the actual mechanism of some of the reasons why. The German people were chosen as the oppressor to give back to Jews what they needed, what was lost from them. Now, when you look at the enormity of that oppression, the enormity and the cruelty of that oppression, we can see the amount of power that was relinquished by the Jews. If that's the way they have to get it back. This is not a small matter. In a very large extent, we will also see, as we progress further, that the Holocaust represented the acme or the pinnacle of this Golus process. And that after the Holocaust, something changed in the world that has never changed for 2,000 years. Essentially, right after the Holocaust, what you see is the return of many Jews to Eretz Yisrael. And what was lost, what was changed, which has never been changed before, is the beginning of the end of the Golus, or the beginning of the end of this mechanism as we know it. There are many details about that, we will go into it. But that is the fundamental mechanism of what the Holocaust is about. Why were the German people chosen? What kind of power did they take? What did the Jews do? What kind of involvement was there in what they did to deserve that? These are very deep questions. But essentially, it is this mechanism. This is the mechanism of Tahara that was taking place. Now, once, and this is very critical, by the mechanism of this Tahara, by the mechanism of this Golus, we see that there is a retrieval, number one, so that the victim recaptures his koyach, his power, and the oppressor loses it. And that's essentially what happened. And what happened is that when the German nation oppressed the Jews in the way they did, they relinquished or they lost their entire koyach that they had in Israel. Essentially, as far as all spiritual aspects are concerned, they were almost totally impoverished. And this essentially is what happens in the Golus. When a nation comes up and oppresses the Jews, and the Jews undergo that oppression, it will undergo it only for a certain period of time. And once that period of time is finished, you will find that nation suddenly descending in terms of its importance, and in terms of its power. You will find that. We have not seen that clearly yet in modern history, but you will see that. It is not an accident or a mistake that every nation who have ever oppressed the Jews is no longer here, really. If you go through the entire history of the Jews, and all the nations that oppressed them, starting from Egypt. Egypt, for example, declined right after the Jews left, essentially. Egypt was the most powerful nation on earth for almost 1,500 years, many, many years. From the time of the Old Kingdom, when they first built the pyramids, in about 2500 BCE, all the way down to 1200 BCE. They were the most powerful nation on earth, almost without competition. Shortly thereafter, it was the end of the age of the empire, and the decline of Egypt began. And you never again heard from Egypt as the power they were. That absolute power that the Pharaoh had, or that the people had before, was declined. And essentially, what we know is that the nation declined because of the lost power that was returned back to the Jews. So this is a very, very important concept. This is the critical idea which is behind all the exiles and the problems that Jews have among all the Gentile nations. We, of course, have to discuss this at greater length in terms of some of these mechanisms. But this is the basic idea. In regard to the medrash that we mentioned, where Avram chose Golus over Gehenna, he chose exile over Gehenna. If Avram had chosen Gehenna over Golus, the other way, then we would have been in Israel and we would never have departed. But all the troubles we would have had and the pains would have been in Israel itself. This is very critical. It would have been in Israel itself. Which means that the whole face of human history would have been different. It's an extraordinary thing. The choice that Avram made essentially changed the face of all history after that. That choice. Because what Avram did was choose the mechanism in which would be matire, or which would purify the Jews. So he determined the entire course of Jewish history and the entire course of Gentile history, just by that decision alone. There's a very critical thing that has to be understood in this transference process, especially when it's done collectively. And in order to do that, there's a very important idea that has to be discussed, a very critical idea, and it has to do with examining what exactly is transferred. We have said that when the Jews transgress, they transfer their kedusha because of the damage they've done to some specific Goyish nation, who then becomes the representative of Din and oppresses Israel, the Jews, and then restores the lost kedusha. But we have to examine this in a very fine way, and this is very, very critical to understand many, many aspects of human history. There are two fundamental properties to kedusha, two basic properties. What is kedusha? Kedusha, of course, is the power of existence. It's the power of existence itself. Now, we say that God, the Baruch Shem, is kadosh, is holy. Now, what does that really mean? How do we examine the notion of kedusha or holiness? Now, many people, in trying to examine this notion, graphically portray it as some kind of a light. Like when you see a person who's a saint or a great tzaddik, there's like a light around him or something like that. Kedusha is not a light. Nor does a halo occur as such to represent a certain level of kedusha. What kedusha really means is the fact that the integrity of a certain level of existence is maintained. What do I mean? When the Baruch Shem created the world, he created the concept of existence as we know it. He himself is outside of that concept, but he created the concept of existence as we know it. That existence which he first created was extremely subtle, very, very subtle, in the sense that it's not like the existence that we see now, not at all. It's an existence which is very, very close to a perfect kind of existence, or the perfect kind of existence that is possible. Let me explain. Spirituality, ruchnius. Spirituality is a level or plane of reality. Neshamas exist in the spiritual domain. Malachim, angels exist in a spiritual domain, and they're composed of spiritual substances. Their reality is spiritual. But what is a spiritual reality? It is a level or plane of existence which is much purer than our plane of existence. Much purer. It is much more subtle than to our level of existence. So that they exist in a whole different way. The five senses of the body cannot access spiritual substances at all. But basically, when you have a spiritual substance, it, by virtue of the subtlety or the purity in which it is, will project a certain level of yichud, or oneness, or beauty in the reality itself. And that's a strange notion. It is possible to view on a certain level of reality a certain level of beauty. And what is a certain beauty? In higher realities, there are things or objects which tend to be much closer in principle. The essential way that we perceive these realities are much more harmonious and much more balanced. So that a spiritual reality, let's take an example. Let's say you have a number of spiritual realities, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then you have our reality, number 5, which is the physical material reality. The first level of spirituality is an existential plane, where the substances that are on that plane reflect a much higher degree of unity in its components. What does that mean? It means that there are fewer details. The principle or the inner patterns reflect themselves much more on the surface rather than buried inside of the reality itself. Let me make myself more clearer. Take the concept chair, for example. There are many different types of chair, but all chairs have the same kind of essence, you see. But what it is the symbol, or the manifestation of that essence has many, many different types of beings. There are many different types of chairs. But on a higher spiritual level, an essence is represented by much fewer objects. Not that there are fewer objects actually representing that essence, but what it is that the fewer objects which exist show the essence much closer to the surface. For example, if you want to know the essence of a thing, you've got to analyze it and understand what essentially its function is or what it is. You've got to do this by examining many, many different types of materials or many, many different types of objects, and then finally you understand what the basic principle is of that object. That's because the key idea or the concept of that object is hidden. It's hidden in the physical aspect and in the sensory components of the object. So to figure out what that thing is takes a certain amount of examination. But on a higher spiritual plane, the essence of the thing is much more closer to the surface. Much closer to the surface. So that the unity among things is much clearer seen or revealed. Now this is somewhat abstract, but that's the difference in the different realities. Higher realities, higher spiritual realities have a much greater unity to them, so that the way that you comprehend these realities is clearer, much more precise, and much more evident. That means that if a being which exists on a higher spiritual reality, the thinking process of that being is much quicker and much deeper than our thinking processes. Because that kind of being is able to get to the heart of a matter very rapidly. Why is he able to get to the heart of a matter very rapidly? Because the reality around him shows itself, shows its interior principles much clearer. So he's able to understand it much clearer. Do we see what I'm saying? It's a very abstract thing. But what that means is that the higher realities are higher in the sense that their ability to reflect the internal principles governing that reality are much closer to the surface of that reality. So that it's much easier to perceive the critical internal patterns of the world. You see, that's why when a Malach, for example, looks down at this world, he's instantly able to understand many, many things that would take a very long time for us to understand. Because he sees this world through its internal patterns. He comes inside out, not outside in. You see. But a Malach on his own level will have problems in his own plane to understand what's going on. A Malach on a plane, let's say number 3, will not be able to stand plane number 2. Because plane number 2 is a different existence. The level of that existence is much more harmonious, much more integrated. And the way that objects or things manifest themselves is an entirely different fashion than on a lower level. The Kedusha of a plane of existence is nothing more than the purity of that existential plane. How pure is that existential plane with respect to the way it manifests its reality? We see. How much yichud is demonstrated in that existential plane? The higher we go in spiritual realms, the more yichud there is. The more yichud it means the greater is the presence or the will of God. Every level of reality is a will of God. It's a level of His will, you see. And every level of reality in some way reflects the power of His unity. And the power of His unity is reflected in the way that reality manifests itself. Higher planes have a much higher manifestation of unity. Hence they have a higher kedusha. They have a much greater beauty. And a being is drawn to those higher planes. There's a much greater simcha, you see, just being on that plane. Because it's almost like you don't have to work to see beauty or to understand something. It just automatically flows in. Okay, let me then just give a short idea of what I'm saying and try and catch what I'm saying here. God. What is the Ribono Shel Olam? Who is He? Essentially, the following. There are two circles. One circle is called essence, and the other circle is called existence. Okay? Two circles. Existence simply means the fact that you are. You exist. Essence is the way you are. What are you? You see. What kind of existence are you? For example, a tape recorder and a radio. They both exist. They both exist. But they're not the same thing. A tape recorder has a whole different definition than a radio. The definition is the essence. So even though they both have the same kind of existence, they have different essences. Do we understand that? God. In God, in all other objects, all things which are, there are two aspects to it, if you'll notice. There is the fact that it exists, and the way it exists. Its essence. And that's the true of everything in this world, everything in the world that we see. There's an essence, and there's an existence. Connected together, hence you have the thing. But when you look at the Ribono Shel Olam, the essence of God is existence. Meaning that if you want to understand who is God, God is the very process itself. He is the act of being. That's His essence. So if you want to understand who He is, God is existence itself. That's why God was always here. God was always around, He was always here because He is the process. And the process by definition is. Existence is. You see? That's fundamentally what He is. He's not a being who exists. There's not two separate aspects to it, like you are or the tape recorder exists. It's not like that. Our language describes everything as an essence which undergoes an activity. So there's two things. There's a subject and a predicate. You see. Yosef is. You know that? Yosef is the essence. That's the particular individual, the unique aspect of the individual. Is. He happens to exist. But there are two things. And we connect the two. But they're two separate concepts. But when you say God is, that's not true. What do I mean it's not true? Of course He exists. But God and existence are not two separate things. God is the word is itself. That is God. Is the essence. It is a being in itself and to its own right. Therefore, these two circles, when it comes to God, are the same circle. They're concurrent circles. Do we see that? They're exactly the same circle. Now, when those two circles coincide, a very strange thing happens. You can no longer identify the individual. God is no longer discernible or knowable. Because what happens is that when essence and existence exactly merge entirely, this essence is no longer distinguished from existence or vice versa. So to exist is to be God is to exist. It's the same thing. And that unity is so powerful that you cannot grasp it anymore, because you can only grasp something from its essence. How do you grasp something? From essence. But the essence has to be distinguishable. It has to be in some way individuated from the existence. It has to be separated from it. So it says, oh, I understand, this is. You've got to be able to separate it. If it's not separate, if it's totally merged, then there's nothing the mind can latch onto and understand, because there is no essence at all. The essence is so wrapped up with the being, it's so merged with the existence, that it's no longer capable of being knowable. There is no essence in itself. Now you all have some problems with this, because you're thinking, well, what's the problem here? Why, if I think of existence, I can think of existence alone, but you have to remember, when you think of existence, you're also thinking of an essence which exists. Because existence has a definition, like eating or sleeping, which happens to be. So even our existence is not the existence of God. It's a whole different thing. So when you say that God is existence, it's not the existence that's capable of being enunciated or pronounced. It's not that. Because the word existence, the way we say it, already has an essence. It's an essence which exists. In other words, existence possesses existence. That's really what's going on in our mind, and that's not God's existence. Because an absolute merge of the two is an existence that doesn't exist. The existence, or the essence and the existence, are so connected that there's no differentiation whatsoever. So therefore, essentially, when the circles are connected or concurrent, there is no possibility of knowing it. When God first created reality, what He did was, He separated the two circles from essence and existence. And when He did that, suddenly, we have this kind of being. You see that? The two circles are almost concurrent, but there's a slight places where they're not. You see that? So therefore, this being becomes distinguishable, because it now has an essence which is separate from existence, and it becomes knowable. But then God went ahead and created another level of reality, like this. And then another one, like this. And then finally, what we see is circles which are gradually separating. In other words, essence and existence are gradually separating. Now what does that mean? What does that mean? This is a very big problem. Because none of us can ever really understand what this is like in reality. Because we are used to a certain level where the circles interact. And our reality has the circles going on like this. The two circles are almost separate. That's the nature of our existence and the existence of everything in our plane. The two circles are almost separate. That's why when the two circles are almost separate, there are so many things out there, so many details, and such a multitude of items. You see, you have billions and billions and billions of things. You see, because the way we exist in a way where the essence and the existence are almost separate. So because of that, many, many different things become possible. A multitude becomes possible because the formula for its existence is such that the two circles are basically separate, mostly separate. You see what I'm saying? But there are realities where those circles merge to a greater degree. And when those things merge, the possibility of more and more items becomes nil. So that in a world where the two circles of essence and existence are almost concurrent, there are very, very few things in that world. Not because there are few things in the world like there are fewer chairs or whatever it's on, but the possibility of a multitude is not there. You see? And therefore that world, the unity of that world is much higher, much purer. But there are many different planes. Each one of these planes is totally different. A being which exists on one plane or a lower plane cannot understand a being on the higher plane because his mind is whatever his head is. Whatever the aspect of mind is on that plane cannot understand an essence which is more merged with its existence. You see? Each being can only understand the ratio of essence to existence as it exists on his plane. But if you alter that ratio between essence and existence, you see, you alter his ability to be able to be aware of another plane of existence. That's why we can't see a neshama, we can't see a soul, because the entity of a soul, the way it exists, its essence and existence are much closer. So we cannot grasp that kind of existence at all. You see, it's not that we can't see it or touch it or feel it, we can't grasp it. It's beyond mind as we know it. But on the world of the neshama, it's not. You see. But even in spiritual worlds, there are certain spiritual worlds which also have that. But they can't grasp a higher ratio, and so on. So in other words, with God varied in existence are many, many planes of reality. Many, many different ways that existence is taking place, depending on the ratio of essence to existence. That's why Hashkafa in certain ways is so hard to understand, especially the Kabbalah. Because the Kabbalah essentially discusses planes of existence. And it's very hard to understand that, because we can't relate to it at all. We can only relate to our plane. Now, I'm bringing all this in because of the concept of Kedusha. Kedusha is nothing more than the essence-existence ratio. That's all it is. It is the manifestation of that essence-existence ratio, as it is. And the benefit of that Kedusha, or the essence-existence ratio, is the benefit of how much yichud is in that reality. How much yichud is in that reality. And therefore, how much simcha can you experience from the yichud that you're perceiving? Since all simcha is based on hasagas yichud, or the perception of unity. So God created different realities that reflect different levels of unity in the way it exists. So therefore each reality has a different capacity to give different levels of simcha. You see, now you can begin to understand what Olam Haba is. Olam Haba, and what will happen when the neshamas of the world transform the material world. I keep on talking about dichuk, or the transformation of physical reality in some strange way. As if there's some kind of magical process, and suddenly the body will become transparent of some sort, and you'll be able to see kedusha in some way. But that's not what it is. The real depth of what Olam Haba is that Olam Haba is a world that comes from a ratio of essence to existence which is almost separate to a ratio which is almost connected. That's what the transformation is about. That's what it means when you mazachich the bria, when you purify reality. What you do is that the neshamas have the koyach to elevate the whole plane of existence in their different yichud levels or kedusha levels. So that automatically, as it's going higher and higher, and its own being is changing, you see, in the process, it suddenly finds itself on a plane or level where it has an incredible capacity for simcha by virtue of its state of being. Let me just recapitulate and just simply say this. All of reality is based on the two notions of essence and existence. But the two will coincide on different ratio points. In its highest point, where essence is existence, that's Gunasham, that's God, that's the Ein Sof. In its lowest point, when essence and existence is totally separate, you have non-existence. And in between, you have successively different types of ratios, so that essence and existence merge in different ways, to different degrees. The difference between all these different ratios is essentially the manifestation of that kind of reality. And the fundamental concept is that the degree of ratio between essence and existence that exists on each reality will determine the kind of yichud or unity that reality will project. And ultimately that will determine the level of hasagas yichudo which is from that reality, and the simcha which a person can obtain in that reality. The question that we have to ask, or is being asked, is the world of Chesron different than the world of Kilkol? And that's a shorthand for saying the world of Adam Rishon before he sinned was a higher world than the world of Adam after he sinned, because of the Kilkol, or the Zohar, the impurity which went into physical reality and caused it to descend. The question is, did that affect the essence-existence ratio in that plane? And the answer is, it did affect it. Obviously it did. Because Adam Rishon was in a much higher spiritual plane than we are now. So that is affected. But not in a major way. In a very subtle, minor way. The world that was created for Adam Rishon is called Olam Hazer. This world, our world. That world has a fixed essence-existence ratio. And therefore cause the amount of things that we see. It is responsible for the number of different objects and the multifarioususness or the variation in the things, in the entities that we see in our world. When Adam sinned, you see, there were things that were affected, but what was affected was not substantially that essence-existence ratio. There were other things that were affected, really, you see. But in some way, the ratio was probably affected in a very minor level. A very minor level. Because Olam Hazer is Olam Hazer, you see. The concept here is Kedusha. And I was saying, I'm trying to give you a sophisticated understanding of what Kedusha is. Kedusha is not a substance or some kind of a thing itself. Kedusha is a property or characteristic of a certain level of reality. And essentially, Kedusha means holiness. Now, why does it mean holiness? Because essentially what the Bunchim says to you is the following. I want you to maintain a certain holiness. In other words, I want you to maintain the possibility of entering the higher plane of existence. The more you bring yourself down, the more physical you become, the further you go away from the higher levels of existence. And as you do that, you will lose Kedusha. That's essentially what's involved, you see. Kedusha is gained or lost, depending whether you ascend or descend on the levels of reality. That's essentially what it is. But the Buddhism says, Kedusha to you, I want you all to be holy. Means that I want you to devote yourselves to a higher spiritual realm, to divorce itself to a certain degree from this realm and attempt to elevate it to a higher level of yichud, or a higher level of essence-existence ratio. And that's basically the concept. That's what Kedusha is from an existential standpoint. But it's important to examine Kedusha, you see, from some of its other aspects. And basically what we see in Kedusha is that Kedusha provides two things: Oz and Tiferes. Oz, the word Oz in Hebrew means strength or power. Tiferes in Hebrew means beauty. Oz and Tiferes. What is Oz and what is Tiferes? Oz is exactly what it is: power. You see, it is power. What resides in the Jew is the power to transform reality, to elevate reality to higher levels of Kedusha. He has that power. It is a dynamic power invested in him to be able to transform existence. That power, which enables him to elevate the world to higher levels of existence, also allows him to bring in higher levels of yichud, or the oneness of God, which automatically comes through the higher levels of existence. But that's the Oz of a Jew, that's the power of a Jew. And that power comes from the Kedusha which is in him. Since his neshama comes from a very high plane, his neshama has the capacity to elevate the world to a high plane, and to show a much higher degree of yichud of the Bnei Shalom. Tiferes. Tiferes is beauty. Tiferes is not the power to elevate, but Tiferes is the ability to appreciate or to perceive. It's the ability to look in any particular plane and see the yichud there. That yichud, or the yichud of that plane, is called beauty. And that's what beauty is, as I've said a number of times. Beauty is nothing more than the perception of unity. It's the perception of harmony, of integration, of balance, of equilibrium. It's the conception of what? The perception of many things coming together to form a gestalt or a whole, harmonious whole, which is greater than the sum of those parts. You see. That's what beauty, whether it's beauty in whatever you want to talk about, that's essentially what beauty always really is. The ability to perceive beauty on any plane is called Tiferes. Therefore, the Kedusha of a Jew has a certain amount of power and has a certain amount of Tiferes. The power which resides in the Jew is the Shema, enables him to do certain things and to perceive certain levels of unity. Do we understand this? That is Oz and that is Tiferes. Now, here comes the real blow. Understanding this, we now understand something which is very critical. When the Jews sin, they lose their Kedusha. And when they lose their Kedusha, what are they giving up? They're giving up their Oz and they're giving up their Tiferes. That's what's happening. But who are they giving it up to? And where is it going? It is going, remember, to the other neshama, or rather to the other nefesh, in this case the Goyim, who then oppress the Jews. But what it means is amazingly that the Goyim are inheriting, or they're acquiring, you see, the Kedusha of a Jew, or the Kedusha of the Jewish nation, and therefore they absorb the power and the perception of yichud that comes with it. That's the key word. It's not only the fact that it's suddenly taking the Kedusha and they can go over and bang them on the head with it. You see, it's much deeper. What they're taking from the Jew is the very essence of what that Kedusha is. Its ability of Oz and its ability of Tiferes. Now, what does that mean? What is he taking from the Jew? What has he robbed from the Jew? And he hasn't robbed it externally. He doesn't come over and rob something. But it is a form of gezela, it's a form of robbery. But what is he taking from him? And the understanding this is extremely vital in understanding many, many aspects of the history of the world. Let's examine this again. When the Jews lose their Kedusha, they're losing the old Tiferes to come with it, the power and the beauty that comes with, the capacity to perceive beauty which comes with it. Okay? That's what they're losing. It goes into the hands of the Goyim. Now the question is, once the Goyim have it, what are they doing with it? Or what does it mean when the Goyim have it? Before I go into that, when the Goyim oppress the Jews, it obviously begins to return. But let's examine what it looks like when the Goyim have it. What essentially the Goyim have it is the following. And there's a very famous pasuk in Tehillim which reflects that. It says, Ad Matai Uzecha Bashevi. Well, V'natan Uzecha Bashevi V'tfatcha B'yad Tzor. And in the davening we say this twice a week, on Mondays and Thursdays before they learn the Torah. And we say to God, how long will the power, your power, be in captivity and your beauty in the hands of the enemy? That's what it says. Ad matai uzecha bashevi. How long, you see, will your power be in the hands of, in captivity? Shevi means captivity. Tif'atcha, and your beauty b'yad tzor, in the hands of the enemy. You see these two characteristics? It means, how long will the Kedusha reside in the hands of the enemy by the Goyim? That's what David HaMelech said. And that's what we daven. We say that as a question. Now the question is, what does it mean that it's in their hands? What it means is the following. If the Jew has the power to elevate reality, if a Jew has the power to bring reality to a higher plane so that the yichud of God becomes more manifest, then when the Goy has it, he has the power to stop that elevation. He has the power to what? To force this world or the physical world to be the place to be. He has the ability to make this place to be. He has the ability to control and manipulate the physical world so that the yichud is not evident. Let's explore this again. Oath. The oath in a Jew. When a Jew has oath, what does it mean? He has power to elevate the world. But what does it mean when the Jew has power to elevate the world? When a Jew elevates the world, he's saying that God is one. The unity belongs to God. The power belongs to God, not me. That's what it means when you elevate the world. When you elevate the physical world from one plane to another, you're saying that God is the absolute force or power, or the absolute entity who controls. Not me. You see, I'm not the yochid, I'm not the single one, God is the single one. That's what oath means. You see, when the Goy has that power, he prevents it, and he says, no, I'm the one, and God is not. What the Goy does is stop the elevation, and causes the world to descend, and says, no, the yichud which you're trying to bring, by elevating it, I will prevent and block. I will put the yichud on this world, and I will be the yichud. I will hide the yichud of God and force the physical world to maintain itself and stabilize. And when it stabilizes, I will usurp the yichud for myself. So suddenly the Goyim find themselves with an incredible power to dominate and control the planet. That's where all the military might of the Goyim come from. All the power, the military might that they have, all the technological powers which they have, comes from the quality of oath. Their ability to control reality as never has been seen before, or their ability to control the world, comes from this quality of oath. Because what does all technology and all the powers of the Goyim really do for them? It makes them believe in their supremacy, in their yichud. But that's exactly the opposite of what the Jews want to do. If you recall, what's the essence of our world? The essence of our world is that God hides. God hides meaning that God's yichud is absent. And that's the notion. The essence-existence ratio is so low that God can hide. Because there are so many things out there, there is no unity. So we can say that there is no God. There's no unifying force or pattern and everything. It's all chaos. It's my power. And that allows you therefore to usurp the power for yourself. That's what this world is about. It's a world of chesron, of imperfection. And the imperfection is caused by God's absence. Or parent absence. You see. But the Jew has the power to restore God's power or God's presence and bring them back. When he brings them back, he's bringing back the fact that God is the one. When the Jews lose that power, then the Goyim have the power to what? To negate that possibility and say, no, this physical world is where it all is, and God is not the one. I am the one. It allows the Goyim to conceal God's existence, or to maintain that absence. Do we see the point? That's the thing. The Goyim can keep God out with that oath. Just like the Jews can bring God back with it, the Goyim can keep him out. But But how do Goyim keep them out? They keep them out because they assert and they are able to prove that physical existence is the be-all and end-all of everything. And they're able to do it because they can dominate and control physical reality. It is Oz which gives the Goyim their power, their physical powers, and their technological powers. First, what is first? First is the appreciation of Yichud. It's not the establishment of Yichud. You see, that's what Oz is. Oz is the ability to establish Yichud, to succeed in establishing Yichud. First is the ability to perceive Yichud once it's established. Now, if the Goyim have the Oz to hold off the Yichud on this world, if they have the Oz, if they have the strength to force God again to hide or to be absent, you see, then what Yichud is it that they're perceiving? They're perceiving the Yichud of the physical world, and they're allowed to see it in all its glory. Hence, the ascent of science, music, the arts, architecture, design. You see all that? What is all that, please? What is all that? That is the appreciation of the awareness of beauty on the physical realms. Since the Goyim have blocked the ability of the world to elevate, they therefore can see the unity in the physical world. And what's the unity in the physical world? Science. The awesome ability to look into nature and see how it works. That's God's Yichud working in natural law. That's God's Yichud working in physical reality. But that's a very strange Yichud. Because even though it's God's Yichud, God is able to be absent. That's the strange thing. Because He hides His Yichud in natural law. God allows the world to manifest the level of Yichud without in any way certifying who that author was. That's why this world is a world of perfection, you see. When God creates a reality, that reality must demonstrate Yichud. It must. Because that's the nature of God's work. Since the Bnei Shalom is Yichud, everything which He does and everything which creates is manifest or reflects Yichud. So the Bnei Shalom doesn't tamper with the ability of a reality to reflect the Yichud. He doesn't do that. But what He does, He tampers with the ability of that Yichud to what? To demonstrate that God exists. That's why you can have biologists and microbiologists and molecular biologists who can understand the depths of all biological processes and understand what DNA is, and they can replicate the thing, and they can do all these different things, and they can understand the incredible actions of all these things, and still say that the world comes from evolution and that there is no God and everything happens chaotically and by chance. Sometimes you wonder, how can they do that? How can they see such incredible design and such a perfect system and say that there's no author, there's no intelligence behind them? It all happened by chance. Because that's the nature of physical reality. That's the nature of Yichud in a physical reality. God allows the world to manifest Yichud because that's what His activity is, but He hides Himself. So that in some way you can perceive this incredible Yichud and still not believe in God. You can believe in natural law or cause and effect. So the Goyim, therefore, when they take the power of that Kedusha, have now the power not only the Oz to fixate themselves as the Yichud, but they have the power to perceive the Yichud in physical reality. So they're able to understand the inner depths of natural law, biology, chemistry, physics, astronomy, and so on. But they're also able to understand the Yichud in life, the Yichud of sound. They're able to create the most beautiful music. That's the gift given to them. They're also able to create the great art. They can build the most beautiful buildings and designs because they've captured the Yichud. You want to know where the Oz in the Seferos lies? And this is the most incredible thing of all. You think that the Goyim represent Tumah. That's what you think. People who learn and they're into Torah and so on think that they have the Kedusha and that the Goyish Wealth has nothing. They have nothing more than darkness and Tumah. That's absolutely false. They have our Kedusha. They have our Oz and our Teferet. You ask me, where is it? Where is this power of the Goyim? This power of Oz is in the financial district, Wall Street. Wall Street, for example, is the power of the Oz, is the dominance of all the capital markets in the world. And it represents the power of the Goyim to do whatever they want to do. It is the power that they have, the financial power. Where else is it? It's in the Pentagon, or wherever have you, in the military might of the Goyim. But that might which they have is Kedusha. Make no mistake about it. It's not darkness and it's not Choshen. It's true, pure Kedusha. But it's our Kedusha invested in the Klippa, in the darkness. When darkness usurps Kedusha, it feeds on it. And as it feeds on it, it grows. It becomes strong and it becomes beautiful. Tumah becomes strong and Tumah becomes beautiful. How can Tumah and Choshen, how can darkness be beautiful? And impurity. It can, because it lives on that Kedusha, it absorbs and usurps the power of the Kedusha, it's yearning from it. Meaning that it absorbs, it's nourished by it and supported, and it reflects it within it. But what's the power of Kedusha, what's in the hands of Goyim, or what's in the hands of what? Of evil. The power of Kedusha is simply what? The power and the strength that the Goyim have to assert their own supremacy, to defy God and to war against Him. That's what happens when Kedusha is in the hands of a Tumah. Do we see? So the power of the nations of the world, especially the nations of the world, is where the Oz lies. And the greatest Oz lies on Manhattan Island. It is a very strange thing that when finally mankind comes close to the end, the most greatest power that's invested in mankind lies in this island called Manhattan. It's interesting, because that's really where the enormous power of the United States lies. The essence of it lies there and in Washington. But on this little island, on the East River, contains the oils of the strength of the world in its own way. Of course, it's distributed, but that's where it is. It's the might of the American empire, and it's the might of the Goyim itself. What about the Tferes? You want Tferes? You want beauty? Look at the beauty of the Goyim, besides their music and art. Look at their buildings and their structures. Here's a very famous statement that, and if you'll notice, when you daven in a shul, when you daven in an Orthodox shul, you ever compare an Orthodox shul to a Reform or Conservative shul? You ever look at the two? Why is it that every Orthodox shul is a broken down steeple? Really? Whereas the Reform and the Conservative have the most magnificent structures of all. Why? Isn't it a strange thing? Why is it that they have the money to build the most glorious structures? You see. And the Orthodox Jews have the least amount of money to build anything. Why? Because the origins first are not in the Torah, where we know it today. It is among the people who defy the Torah, and we will get into this later on, because we're talking about Jews now. But essentially what we're saying is that the origins first lie where? With the Goyim. You see. Walk down, for example, even over here, walk down the beautiful buildings on 5th Avenue or 6th Avenue and see the elegance and sophistication of what the Goyim are capable of. What is that? That's not Goyim, that's Kedusha. That's Kedusha. The elegance of a Waldorf or a Hilton or whatever hotel, the elegance of any of these places, the incredible structure that they are, is the beauty of Kedusha invested in a Choshech or in a Tumah. And that's essentially what it's about. The power is our power in the hands of a Klippa. The Chachma of the Goyim, the knowledge of the Goyim is stupendous. The knowledge of the sciences, the technology is awesome. Look what they're doing in terms of computers and in terms of the entire automation industry. It is staggering. The speed of these devices and the complexity of these devices. The ability of man to go to the moon and to do all kinds of other things that stagger the mind. We can't even go into the technological prowess of what the Goyim have achieved. Where can you see this in the world of Torah? You cannot. You cannot. If you look at the world of Torah, or if you look at the world of this world, you will see an incredible impoverishment. In fact, you will notice a very strange thing. That at the beginning of time, the Jews were greatest. In the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, in the prophets. And as history went on, the Jews lost more and more what? Of their ability to know wisdom and to know Chachma. And the Goyim have gone up the ladder, and the Jews have gone down the ladder. You notice that very inverse kind of thing? Why? Because of the transfer of the Kedusha, of the Oz and Tferes to the Goyim. as the Jews sin more and more, they lose their Kedusha. They lose the power and they lose the beauty. They lose the ability to see the unity of God in the world. They lose that ability. So even their Torah becomes impoverished. Incredibly impoverished. And the knowledge and the wisdom of the Goyim becomes stupendous. That's the balance. Only one nation can dominate the world in Kedusha. Either the Jews do it or the Goyim do it. And there's a transfer one on the other. And it's like a seesaw. But it's very critical that you understand what is the difference between the Jews and the Goyim in that seesaw. It's very important that you understand what the Jews are losing in the Oz and Tferet and what the Goyim are gaining. What does it look like when that Kedusha is back in the hands of the Jews? What? And they wonder, what is it like? What would it be like if that Kedusha was restored to the Jews? The Oz and Tferet. And the truth is, there's no way I can describe it to you. There's no way. What would happen is, it's not that suddenly the Jews begin to build beautiful shuls or hotels, or suddenly become the financial magnates of the world. That's not what it is. That's simply taking Kedusha in the form of Tumah and transferring that. You're transferring the whole Tumah with its Kedusha in it. That's not the retransfer, that's not the retrieval. Do we see the point? Many people think that. Many people think that what will happen in the future when this situation does occur. And that's in essence what the Yemot Mashiach is, the Messianic time. In the Messianic time, that transfer will take place en masse and will become visible. So many people think, what does that mean? It means that the Jews become the top bananas in the world. You see, we will have the military might, or we will be the financial wizards of the world and the technological geniuses. But that's not what it is at all. You see, that's simply imitating the Goyim. That's the point. What is it like when the Kedusha leaves the Klippa and comes to where it belongs? Then what happens is the Goyim collapse. The whole thing that they have collapses. How does it collapse? Is it real? It is real. How can science collapse? It doesn't actually collapse. The knowledge remains there. But the supremacy of their yichud, the supremacy of the way they interpret yichud collapses. What definitely collapses is the fact that they think the illusion of their own yichud, of their own power. That definitely collapses, and suddenly they see that they're at the bottom of the barrel. You see, that definitely collapses, and they see that they have no power at all. But even the things they've established, what happens is it loses its incredible supremacy. And then it goes back to Torah, and a new form of wisdom arises. And if you can understand this form of wisdom, it is the most incredible thing. That's when it says in the Pasuk, Kimi Tzion Teitze Torah. From Tzion will come with Torah. It's not talking about a Torah that we learn now. You know what people think? People think that when the Mashiach arrives, learning and Torah will become supreme, and everybody will suddenly want to base Medrash and start learning. That's what they think. That's not true. Because the way that we learn Torah is impoverished. What the Jews don't understand is that the greatest consequence of a sin is the loss of Torah. The loss of Yichud, the loss of Kedusha. That means that a Jew will sit and learn the Torah, and it's darker and darker. He has less and less understanding of what it's telling him. That's what it means. What happens if you can really read the Torah the way it's supposed to be read? Then you can look into it and you can see the reason for everything that happens. You can see the causes of all things. You can see why everything was designed the way it is. You can see the interconnection between the spiritual and the physical universe. You can understand why the law of gravity is designed the way it is. Not simply the achievement of describing the law of gravity or mathematically predicting it. You can determine and understand its ultimate design. No goy can do that, and no science can do that. But you can do that when the yichud, when the Tferet goes back to the Torah, then the Torah becomes a text. It becomes a text which enables you to see the understanding of the inner patterns and the inner laws and the inner principles governing all of reality from beginning to end. What is absolutely hidden the cause, for example, of all human history, why things happen to you personally, the meaning of history, which is totally hidden from us, is open when that first goes back. And suddenly, it's as obvious to you as science is obvious to a scientist. You see what happens? As the Jews lose their yichud, as they lose the kedusha and they lose it first, they lose the ability to look into the Torah and to see the critical internal principles that guide all reality. They lose the ability to see it. They lose the window to heaven. They lose the window of understanding the yichud which exists on higher planes. The most amazing transfer occurs. The Jews say every day, twice a day, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Every day, an Orthodox Torah observant Jew declares that there's one God, right? But that Jew, because of his sins, loses the ability to understand what that means. To understand what it means that God is one, by having the ability to look into reality and seeing a totally consistent pattern, is lost. So then it becomes a simply verbal statement. I believe that there's one God. I have no understanding how God is one. Because the whole world looks chaotic to me. I have no understanding, but I will say verbally that God is one. He no longer has the ability to understand or give meaning to that phrase. Who has the ability to give meaning to that phrase? The Goyim. They can tell him how God is one. Except that since they're in the Klippa and in the Tumah, they understand the unity of God factually, to a very high level, but they refuse to verbally say it. So they say they are God. So the Jew has the ability to say God is one, but he doesn't understand it anymore. The Goy understands it and refuses to say it. Do you see this topsy-turvy situation? Extraordinary, isn't it? That is the punishment of the Jews. But of course, the Goy will never admit that there's a God in a real sense. Scientists will never really get up and really admit that there's a God behind it. They will do everything to combat it, you see. Because why? Because they're coming from a power of tumah. That's the power where the Kedusha resides, and therefore, that power will never allow the unity of God to become established. But at the same time, they still have that power and that beauty, and the Jews will have lost it. So that when we learn Torah in the time of the Mashiach, it will not be the same Torah as we learn now. Now, what do I mean? The Torah will be the same that we have. That's not going to be changed. Not one word or one letter in the Torah, as it's written, will not be changed. But what will be altered is our ability to understand it. So that what a base message will look like in the future has no resemblance to what it looks like now. You see? What it looks like now when you go to Boston and you see Harvard and MIT, when you go to all the Ivy Leagues and Princeton and you see the incredible sophistication and grammar that these universities have and the way they represent Chachma, that will be taken away from them. And someday there will be a base medrash in Yerushalayim, which will be the center of this kind of life. Will suddenly expound the Torah with its entire unity intact. And suddenly the unity of all existence and reality will become visible. And it will dwarf science. It will not negate it, because it can't. Science is the expression of God's unity in the physical world. Science doesn't belong to man. Science belongs to God. Man is the one who learns it, or discovers it. But natural law belongs to the Ribono Shel Olam. It's his world. So science, or the laws of science, aren't negated. What is negated is the fact that science represents the beginning and end of all wisdom. That becomes negated because suddenly we see that science is the lowest level of yichud. It's the yichud of the guf, or the yichud of physical reality. You see? So it's a very inferior form of yichud. But there are levels of yichud and insights and understandings and wisdoms which are infinitely greater than what's provided by science. But it cannot be provided in science. It is in the Torah. And the lock, the key to that Torah will be opened up so that yichud becomes visible. That is the restoration of Kedusha to Klal Yisrael. Tisha B'Av. What is the churban of Tisha B'Av? When that Beis HaMikdash destroyed, the window was destroyed. The Torah in its way was destroyed. Very critical. That is the churban. And that is a churban or destruction that nobody appreciates. Because you are not aware of what you lost. Nobody knows what we lost in the Torah. You see. But what we lost in the destruction of the first temple wasn't a building. It was the ability to access a certain level of yichud in the Torah. That's why there were prophets at that time. But when the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, prophecy was taken away from the world. And with prophecy went the ability to understand a certain level of yichud which exists in the Torah. That was gone. So never again would Jews have access to that level of wisdom. Their faces would become more and more blank as they steer into the Torah and say, what is it saying? What does it mean? That's really what would happen. That is the real Churban Beis HaMikdash. Because the Shekhinah went into exile. The Shekhinah in the time of the first temple was totally surrounded by the Klippa or by the Tumah, so that its ability to project that yichud was minimal. And the Torah declined. Because when the Shekhinah, which is the source of that beauty, the source of that light, and the source of all those realities, descends into exile, when it is surrounded by its barriers, then the world descends in its ability to receive that light and appreciate the Oz and Yichud. But where does that Oz and Yichud go? Where does that Oz and Ferus go? Where? If the Shekhinah loses the ability to give it over to the Jews, and the Jews no longer have the ability to take it, we think that simply things are blocked and that's the end of it, and somehow the whole thing is stored in some mysterious cabinet in the heavens. It's not true. It is stored in the Goyim. They have it and they use it. And that's what it's all about. From the loss, we can have some idea about the gain. By understanding what it means that we lost this Kedusha and this Oz and Ferus, we can have some understanding of what it means when we regain it in the times of the Mashiach. But, you ask me, where do I see this loss? Can I demonstrate it to some degree in history? And I can at two different points, which look totally unrelated. The first Beit HaMikdash, the first temple was destroyed, and when that temple was destroyed, direct access, or the ability to access spirituality, was lost. Prophecy was gone. All the things were gone that we knew from before. If you would think that something that Kedusha left the Jews, we know it left, so where did it go? It went to the Goyim. But wait a minute, where did it go? Let's see if we can't figure it out. So the trick is to do is to look in the history books, okay? Around the same time as the destruction of the temple. Now you'll see. And the destruction of the temple was in 586 BCE. So then our job is to look, Sirsa, around that period of time, give or take 50 years, and see if there wasn't something that happened to the Goyim that was new and powerful that never happened before. Do you see what I'm doing? Let's see if we can't spot the transference indirectly. In other words, you're not going to see the Kedusha suddenly come out and just shift to the Goyim. You're not going to see that physically or visibly. But historically you will see it. So we want to do that. It's very difficult to see it because it's not easy to see that shift. It's subtle. But we can go with the most catastrophic periods of Jewish history. For example, like the destruction of the first and second temple. We can do that. And we can try and see then, couldn't we, if there was any kind of upsurge in the Goyish Welt, that they had something they never had before. So let's do our homework and let's see who's sophisticated here in history. What was going on in the world of the Goyim? Sirsa, the 5th century BC, 580, 550, 540, around that time. Does anyone have some kind of idea? Greece. There was a man, Thales of Miletus, who's called the father of science. He was the first one that began to look at the world objectively and examine reality from its own standpoint. He is the first one that introduced the concept that if you want to understand something about reality, ask the question to reality. Don't make up the solution. Or begin to examine reality from its own natural law standpoint. When did Thales live? He was the first of the Greek philosophers, the earliest one. When did he live? He lived in about 540, 550, 560. That's when he lived. It was the beginning of Greek science and Greek wisdom. Before then, what was Greece? Greece was nothing more than mythological Greece, which based on what? The Homeric period of the Iliad. Greece was essentially a country steeped in the belief in Greek mythology. It was in the 5th century that Greece suddenly broke free of these superstitions and polytheism and established the cult of science, or the cult of what? Intellect. And of course from Thales, you had Pythagoras and Anaximander and Anaxagoras and so on and so forth. Then you had Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and all the people, all the great Greek philosophers. In fact, the Greeks, what they did was so powerful that I've heard history professors say that the essence of Western civilization started from Greece, and not much has occurred since then. Because it's really true. All of Western civilization, which is science and technology, if you examine, where does all this come from? It comes from the ability to look at reality in a certain way. Not superstitiously, but the ability to look at reality from its internal natural laws, to see the explanation of why things happen in reality itself. That's the beginning of science. And the ones who first started this were the Greeks. So we see an amazing thing, don't we? That when the Kedusha left Kaiser and the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore the ability to access spirituality was gone, it went into the Goyim, and the Goyim suddenly took it and gained and opened up their eyes to begin the what? To begin the journey into great wisdom, Chokhmah, science, philosophy. That's when it really started. Interesting. Let's look at the second time, the destruction of the second temple. What major thing happened then? The second temple was destroyed in 70 CE. Okay? What was happening in 70 CE? What was beginning to happen then? Christianity. Exactly. But what is Christianity? You know what Christianity is? Christianity is a religion of the Messiah. That's what it is. Christianity is the belief that what? That there exists another world, a future world, and in which you have to work to gain that world. And that there's a Messiah who will come to redeem the world. But that's a Jewish concept. It was the Jews that had this, the concept of a neshama, the concept of a spiritual world, the concept of another world in which your deeds in some way command that and will determine that. The concept that there will some kind be a time when the kingdom of heaven will be on earth as such, in the May, that the Mashiach will appear and Kedusha will come back. These are Jewish concepts. What did the Goyim have to do with this? In fact, before Christianity, what were the Goyim? A bunch of idol worshippers. So suddenly you see an amazing thing. You see the soul of Judaism, the messianic concept, you see, and the belief of Olam Haba suddenly transferred to the Goyim, and the Goyim become a bunch of Jews. That's what it is. But since that Kedusha is in the hands of Goyim, it's still in the hands of Tumah, right? So what do? So they make the Messiah the God. Because they can't handle the yichud of God himself, as we've said. In no way. All the wisdom of the Goyim and all the Kedusha they possess is always out to dethrone God, one way or another. The philosophy of the Greeks will dethrone God from being the author of creation and the author of the world. Christianity will dethrone God because it's going to give him a partner that he's got to live with, namely Jesus Christ. There's another man sitting on the throne next to him. It leaves very little room for God to maneuver himself in the chair. But that's essentially what it is. But even more than that, it's got a Holy Ghost on the right side and Jesus on the left side. So there's three guys sitting in one chair. But that's what it is. That's Kedusha in the hands of Tumah. Kedusha in the hands of Tumah begins to look like Judaism. But there's a very curious flaw. The curious flaw is man is God. It always is that. You see, either man is God because he's the ultimate philosopher, or man is God because he's some kind of Messiah that's going to bring the kingdom of heaven on earth. But somehow man must always be God. That is the flaw when the Kedusha is in the Tumah. You see. But that's Christianity. But when did the Goyim become Christian? When did you have the explosion of Christianity among the Goyim, where they have these Jewish concepts? In the destruction of the second temple. Which again is a shift of Kedusha. So the Baruch Shem said to Kaiser, he said, you don't want the Kedusha, you want to do the Chatoim, then I'll give it to the Goyim. You don't want a Mashiach, you don't want to bring it, let them have the belief. Let them have the belief in the Mashiach. I'll take it away from you. Because that's exactly what happened. You see. The Baruch Shem took away the concept of Mashiach and all these things and the future world and gave it to the Goyim. They are now what? Transformed the converted Jews. In fact, he did such a good job, is that the Goyim, the Christians themselves say that what? That God abandoned you and we are Israel. A true Christian will call himself an Israelite. Because the truth is that's what he believes. He has taken over what the Jew is. The Jew, because of his transgressions, has been abandoned by God. So now he has the Messiah and he has the future world. He is the one. You see, and therefore he is the what? He is the successor or the heir to the children of Israel. That's why these Goyim will constantly use words like Israelites and the sons of Shalom and all that other stuff. these deceptions. Because the Goyim look at the Torah and they say, this Torah was ours. It was yours to the Jews. But you lost the Torah, so we have a New Testament. And now we are the Jews of old. No more you. God threw you out. And He gave us your soul. And He did give it in many ways. Because look at the soul. They have the Ois. They are the most powerful. For years, for 1,000 years, they were the most powerful. Through the Dark Ages and the medieval period. All the way up to what? To many years they were the most powerful. They still are the powerful. Who are the most powerful nations on earth? The Christians. All of Western Europe are the Christians. The Hindus are the most powerful, and neither are the Muslims. It is the Christians who are the most powerful ones on earth. So the Virgin gave them the earth. And He gave them the spirit. He gave the Western civilization the ability to what? To produce science and technology in which it has. So again we see transference, don't we? An incredible thing. One more time. When was the true explosion of the scientific revolution? When? Even though the Greeks started what? Rational thought. That's what they started. But the true beginning of science didn't really appear as we know it. It started when? With Galileo and Newton. They were the first ones that said, wait a minute, it's not enough to think clearly. It's not enough to rationally approach the world. You must objectively experiment with the world. You can't sit here and rationally figure out what the laws of science must be, the laws of nature. You've got to go out and experiment and examine and observe. That was the Galileo-Newtonian method. When did Newton and Galileo live? Galileo lived in the 1500s and Newton lived in the 1600s. You see. So suddenly there was an incredible upsurge of science at that time. You see, which is the science that we have now. In fact, the science of Galileo and Newton was so powerful that it lasted for another 200 years. You see, another 200 years without being changed. So the question is, let's go backwards now. Let's find out some incredible laws in the Jewish world. Okay? We'll work the other way. What happened in the Jewish world in the 1500s and in the 1600s? No, that was earlier, but that's one thing. But there's something else. With the beginning of the Kabbalah, the Ari. For the first time, the Baruch Shem brought down a new light into the world. It is a light which can open up the Torah. It is a light which is really concealed now. But it is a light which is given to the Ari, or Yitzhak Luria, to open up the inner part of the Torah. That is the light really of the Kabbalah. It was given to him as a master, and he began to transmit it. You see, it was the first time God, who concealed this inner light from the Jewish people, said, I'm going to return it to you. But what happened? What happened? The Jews lost it, obviously. And the Ari went over to his most important pupil, of Chaim Vital, and he said to him, pray for the Mashiach ben Yosef, who he happened to be. And I'll explain why that is later. Pray that, because the Mashiach ben Yosef is going to die. And Chaim Vital didn't understand it. And then shortly, a couple of weeks later, the Ari died. And he understood that was lost with the death of the Ari was not only the ability, the fact that the Ari was lost, but what was lost was the possibility to introduce the Messianic time at that point in history. It was a critical time for the Mashiach to arrive. It was. It was lost. So what happened? So suddenly this light which could have been the beginning of the light of Mashiach, you see, what happened? It was transferred to where? To the Goyim. But before it was transferred to the Goyim, it went into the Jews itself, and arose at the same time a man chapter 3, who became the most powerful false messianic figure in all of history. Besides Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba was another messianic figure, but he wasn't false. Because he lived at the time of Rabbi Akiva, at the destruction of the Second Temple. You see. But what we see in this time, in the 16th, 17th century, we see an amazing thing. We see that the Jews lost the Messianic light, and therefore it was given in a corrupt form, in the form of chapter 3, and then was finally transferred entirely to the Goyim. And suddenly, an explosion. The scientific revolution of Newton and Galileo. So we find an incredible thing going on. We find an amazing parallel. You see, what I've done in 3 instances can be done in 1,000 instances. It's not easy. But you see the subtlety, because it's easy for us to do it now because I'm picking the most explosive periods in history. At every point, when the Jews lose the ability to to bring down a messianic light, or they lose the ability to capture, to correct the world, to be Masach in the world. What happens? That power is then transferred into the Klippa. The Shekhinah then goes away, and then the power is transferred to those who access that power, the Goyim. And when they access, suddenly they experience an explosion. But the explosion that they experience is the Kedusha that flows from the Jews. It is the Kedusha with its oaths, its power, its thirst, its ability to perceive Yichud, to see, given to the hands of the Goyim. So they explode. But they don't explode with filth or impurity or just some darkness or ignorance. They explode with wisdom and culture and fineness, you see, and grandeur and sophistication. You want to know where the greatest levels of spirituality is contained? Really? In my opinion? You want to see a real house of worship? You want to see a building which in some way does reflect the dignity which is glorified in God, as far as we're concerned today? Go to the greatest cathedrals in the world. I'm not telling you to go in. Watch from the outside. Watch. See a Notre Dame. Okay? See the greatest cathedral in the world. From the outside, you can't watch the Sistine Chapel or what that church is in the Vatican. See the incredible majesty and dignity on those buildings. Because the way they're constructed with their glass, the stained glass, and the spires, and just the way they go up, you see, has in it an incredible sophistication. There's a certain majestic awe inside those institutions. That's why Goyim don't talk when they daven. They don't. Why not? Because the institutions really reflect a majestic awe. It really does. It's all the buildings. In the entire process of the Goyim, the Catholics, for example, in all the rituals, when you watch them, you will see the solemnity, won't you? The dignity in which they carry themselves on the entire thing. And you look at the structure, you will see that, because that's the Kedusha in the hands of the Goyim. They have the ability to represent God now in a way that we can. But what they don't have, even though they have dignity and majesty, they don't have warmth. They are a cold, dead religion. It is a statue. It looks beautiful, but it's not alive. That's why you'll go into a shul that looks like a mess when it comes to this kind of grandeur, but it has more warmth or more grace in that shul than the whole cathedral has. You see, because the fire of the neshama is still in the shul, but the majesty and the dignity of a divine presence lies with the Goyim. Unfortunate, isn't it? It is. It's a terrible tragedy. There is an aberration. It is an incredible aberration. Anyone who tells you that the Goyim have nothing and that the Goyim are nobody, you see, is talking from total ignorance. The Goyim are something, and they have a lot. They have an enormous amount. Don't undermine what they have. But what you must understand is they have a lot because they have what's ours. That's the point. They have the Kedusha that should have been in the Torah and with Klal Yisrael. The majesty and the awe and the reverence should be with the Jews, but it's not. So we argue amongst each other all the time, constantly battling each other, you see. And we don't fix up, we don't give due respect to the tefillahs that we say or to the shoes that we have. It's a horrendous thing. You can imagine what goes on up there when they look down on a shul and they look down on a church. You see, the whole place goes crazy up there. Why? Because they look down in the shul and they see every guy talking to everyone else in Kriyat Torah and the Chazon Shab, when the Chazan is saying over Shemona Esrei, and when they're reading the Torah or they're davening. People are catching up on the news of the week. And that's what they see in all these shuls. And then they look, like forlorn beings up there, and they look and they see the Goyim. They look at the Vatican and they say, Gewalt, look at this. These people know how to respect God. They deal with the place like a house of God. But why is that? Why? Because we have evicted God from the shul. That's why. We have evicted him. So the Baruch Shem doesn't want to be without a home, so he goes over into the Goyim. But he condemns himself. The Shekhinah condemns himself, his power, of the Baruch Shalom, not the Baruch Shalom himself, but his Tiferes and his Oid is condemned to reside with the Goyim. That's the ultimate decree. Because we have thrown him out. That's really what it is. You see. So we are the reflection. If you want to know why does the Goyim have all the power, look into the shuls. Look into the yeshivas. Look into it. Look at the way we regard Torah. Look at the respect that we give to Torah. Look at it. And you will begin to understand why it is that the Jews have nothing, really, in terms of what they should have had. The crown which they possess, the majesty of their understanding of their life has been taken away from them. And that crown sits on the head of the Goyim. This transfer is no mean or small transfer. We await the day when we will have the retrieval. But what gives us the retrieval? The exile. It is the exile which retrieves the light. The Goyim don't know that when they oppress us, and they cause us pain, and they cause us suffering, they are dying. They are killing themselves. They are destroying their most powerful qualities of Oz and Tiferes. And there will come a time when suddenly it will become evident, you see, and then we will wear the crown again. If people are going to come back, I really don't. No matter what I say, I really don't think they're going to, because in some way they
I spoke to the twins.
who's the twins?
I know their names, but I never.
In the Menachem brothers?
Yeah, probably. And
Did he Gabriel, David, and
they had said that they were planning to come back. They just
who is it?
they didn't, whatever, and they were.
So the Menachem brothers, those are the only twins, in the three brothers.
Yeah, who started?
Two of those brothers have not been here in 9 months, and one guy comes in and out like once a month. I see him. You think I'm going to get those people back?
Which one I spoke to.
I know. I know. Louis, I see him every once in a while by a bris or by a wedding or something like that, and I say Shalom Aleichem to him, and I don't say anything about the Shira, and I never see them again. The last time I saw them in Menachem brothers, all three of them was Yom Kippur.
To me,